In the annals of history, the year 614 AD marked the beginning of a peculiar silence. For centuries, records seemingly dried up, with civilizations falling into what historians now refer to as the Dark Ages. But is it truly a mystery of lost time, or something more deliberate? In 1991, German historian Dr. Heribert Illig introduced a controversial theory, the phantom time hypothesis. His research claims that nearly 300 years of history, between 614 AD and 911 AD, simply didn't happen. According to Illig, this period was a deliberate insertion by the Holy Roman Empire to legitimize their political authority. One significant clue comes from the diary of a European archaeologist, whose field notes highlight strange anomalies. Excavating structures thought to be from the early Middle Ages, I noticed architectural styles that were far too advanced for the supposed time period, they wrote. These styles, including the famed Acton Cathedral, challenged the established timeline, showing features that should have emerged centuries later. Even more puzzling is the lack of archaeological remains from this era. Dr. Hans Ulrich Niemans, a key proponent of this hypothesis, argued in his 1995 paper, "Did the early Middle Ages really exist?" that there's a significant absence of variable artifacts or physical evidence from these supposed centuries. What we attribute to this time might have been retroactively dated, or even fabricated. This startling possibility has attracted attention from researchers across disciplines, pointing to a gap in both physical evidence and historical documentation. Historians investigating this period are now faced with an unsettling question. What if a significant chunk in our history simply never existed? So you're telling me we apparently lost 3 centuries of history? I can barely keep track of what I did last weekend. But sure, let's just casually misplace 300 years. Now, if losing time isn't strange enough, let's talk about something that hits even a little closer to home: our calendar. And no, not just the one you forgot to update on your phone. Calendars are the way we organize time. But what happens when the calendar itself is wrong? The shift from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar in 1582 was supposed to correct a long-standing error in how we track the Earth's rotation. However, while most people think only 10 days were skipped during this adjustment, Illig's research reveals a far more concerning possibility. As many as 300 years were added to align historical events with political ambitions. Here's how it works. When Pope Gregory XIII reformed the calendar, he sought to correct an accumulated drift caused by the Julian system. The problem is that the 10-day correction alone doesn't account for the discrepancies in celestial records. Modern astronomical research, which includes calculating ancient solar eclipses and planetary alignments, reveals that historical events attributed to the missing centuries don't correspond with these celestial events. In his 2008 study, Niemans cross-referenced astronomical observations with modern data and found significant mismatches. He wrote, "The precise timing of solar eclipses and planetary positions between the 7th and 10th centuries simply do not align with the historical dates recorded during that time." This adds weight to the theory that a much larger gap, possibly hundreds of years, exists between historical records and astronomical reality. What's even more curious is that other ancient civilizations, such as the Chinese and Islamic worlds, made calendar corrections without experiencing the massive drift. This raises a critical question: was time manipulated? If the calendar was altered to give legitimacy to certain rulers, how much of history has been fabricated? The discrepancy suggests something more significant than just a few lost days. It implies that entire centuries were inserted to the timeline. Wait a minute. If our calendar has been playing tricks on us, does that mean some of us are technically younger than we thought? Hey, I'll take any excuse to shave off a few years. Speaking of youthful legends, let's talk about a guy who might have been too good to be true. Charlemagne. Few figures loom larger in European history than Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor and the so-called Father of Europe. His reign from 768 to 1814 AD is regarded as the Golden Age, uniting much of Europe and laying the foundation for modern Western civilization. But what if Charlemagne, this legendary ruler, never existed? Dr. Illig's phantom time hypothesis suggests that Charlemagne's life and reign were completely fabricated, created by the Church and the Holy Roman Empire to legitimize their power. Historical records, it seems, are shockingly thin when it comes to proving Charlemagne's existence. His military conquests, his intellectual reforms, these grand achievements may not have been based on fact. In a striking example, the Aachen Cathedral, supposedly commissioned by Charlemagne, contains architectural features that seem out of place for the period. The diary of a respected historian from the 19th century notes, "The design elements in the cathedral are too advanced for the 8th century. In fact, much of the architecture appears to belong to a later time, closer to the 11th century. This would be an extraordinary error if not for the broader context of missing time." In addition, researchers have discovered that no verifiable contemporary records of Charlemagne's reign exist. Dr. Donald Below, in a study published in the Journal of Medieval History, found that many of the documents regarding Charlemagne's life were written decades, if not centuries, after his supposed death. The scarcity of reliable contemporary sources raised serious doubts about his existence. If Charlemagne, the so-called founder of modern Europe, was indeed a myth, what does that mean for the rest of medieval history? Could entire chapters of our past have been fabricated for political purposes? So Charlemagne might not have been real, huh? Guess that would make all those high school history exams a little awkward. Write an essay about someone who never existed. Talk about a trick question. Now, if Charlemagne isn't the only questionable figure in our timeline, what does that say about other world powers during the same period? Let's head east and check out the Byzantine and Islamic empires. The phantom time hypothesis doesn't just challenge European history, it forces us to rethink entire civilizations. Take the Byzantine Empire, for example, whose records between the 7th and 10th centuries contain notable gaps. There are far fewer surviving documents than in earlier or later periods. Even the Great Islamic Expansion, which shaped much of the Mediterranean, holds unusual contradictions. Islamic historian al-Musadi wrote in his Meadows of Gold about his travels across the known world. Yet, curiously, his descriptions of the 9th century towns and cities often don't match archaeological findings from those eras. In fact, one document from the Abbasid period describes city layouts that were decades ahead of their supposed construction dates. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire, which was supposedly thriving during these centuries, shows a shocking lack of archaeological evidence. Dr. Jody Magnus's research highlights how few structures from this period can be confidently dated to the supposed time frame. In her report, Magnus notes, "The Byzantines are known for their monumental architecture, yet the period between the 7th and 10th centuries is conspicuously devoid of major construction. Instead, structures that are attributed to this era often display characteristics more in line with later centuries. These mismatches between recorded history and physical evidence raise significant questions. Were these cities and empires as advanced as records suggest? Or did they come into prominence much later than we've been led to believe? Could the missing years account for these gaps in our understanding of these great civilizations?" Okay, so we got Byzantine buildings that seem to be playing hide and seek, and Islamic cities that are a bit ahead of their time. If this was a game of historical poker, I'd be folding my hand right now. But before we get too lost in the shuffle, let's take a look at a bigger picture. Why would someone want to rewrite hundreds of years of history? Spoiler alert, it's not because they needed more vacation days. If Phillips' hypothesis is correct, it means that much of what we consider historical fact has been manipulated, not accidentally, but deliberately. The question is, why would anyone do this? The answer might lie in power. Those who control history control the present. In 1997, a researcher at the Vatican discovered transcripts of an ancient papal decree, seemingly out of place for its time. The document was dated 718 AD, but referenced a king who wouldn't rise to power until a century later. That strange anachronism fits with the idea that whole swaths of history were written retroactively to align with the needs of those in power, particularly the Church. Further reports from historians such as Dr. Isabella Caruso highlight similar errors in papal records. In one notable case, a decree attributed to Pope Gregory II, dated 731 AD, makes reference to laws and rulers that shouldn't have existed for another 100 years. These small but telling inconsistencies are at the heart of the phantom time hypotheses. So, if entire centuries were fabricated to fit a narrative, it means we've been living in a manipulated version of history. How much else have we been made to forget? What other parts of historical record have been reshaped, twisted, or erased? The truth might be hidden in plain sight, just waiting for those bold enough to question everything.